Okay, should we should we move back, come back? So I was asked a couple of questions during the break that I'm going to try and give 5-minute answers to. They are not 5-minute questions. But they bear some conversation. Somebody had asked about the way Judaism has responded to despair and challenge and the world as it has been experienced by us as Jews. The concept of the world is not always a nice place is something that the Jewish community is, shall we say, very well aware of, probably too well aware of. It has changed the Jewish people to some extent. In some ways, you see things like the psalm that we looked at before as a response to why do things have to be so bad? But the other thing that you probably picked up as we went through is even as, at least for me as a teacher, I also look at this material and say it's really powerful. At the same time, we're allowed to have fun with it too. I know not everybody, somebody might have looked at me and says he's cracking jokes during the middle of a psalm about, despair and misery. Doesn't quite seem appropriate. Part of me responds and says that's part of the Jewish response too, because sometimes the answer is if you don't laugh, you cry, and so Judaism has always kind of had that. Fiddler on the Roof. The answer is it's never about the extremes for the most part. People have said, how do you explain Judaism really quickly? I can't, but one of the values is the idea of the kind of that golden mean, that Judaism teaches us that very little in life is really black and white, that most of life is really gray, and that most of the things are not good or bad in and of themselves, but more of it has to do with what are we doing with them and how are we using them, and that it's about finding balance in our lives. So yes, you could sit there and you could, as I was talking, the table I was talking, there's a technical term used for that, you've all heard probably, called kvetching. Kvetching is the act of the, oi, woe is me. We could do that all the time. At the same time, it's also the reminder of the fact that if you've lived long enough, you know that it's there, right? Part of why I'm pleased to be able to be invited to speak to a group like you is I think once we've had interactions, people get a different sense of Jews and Judaism. I talk to a lot of groups and try to be as open about it as possible, because I think once you meet people, it's much harder to hate something you know a little bit more about, or someone you know, or whatever the case may be. I have experienced in Reading anti-Semitic verbal abuse. I I'm on a first name basis, or I used to be on a first name basis with the postmaster at the Wyomissing post office because hate mail was fairly regular. The part of it that, and I appreciate the response, but at the same time, part of me says, I knew that I was getting that when I signed on for this. For me, the saddest thing is the fact that when I started as a rabbi, going to work was never considered a dangerous thing. We now live in a world where, unfortunately, we have to think about things differently. And I am saddened by that. At the same time, we also struggle to say, how do we keep things open and welcoming at the same time as trying to make sure that we're taking care? So it's about finding the balance and that concept, walking that fine line in between. Other question that was asked was, because the psalm talked a little bit about the dead, there was a question about what does Judaism teach about the afterlife? And my response is that, again, that's not a 5-minute question. But I will try and give you as much of a thumbnail sketch as I possibly can. The first and foremost, the thing to know about Judaism is Judaism teaches that we live in this life, right? What we do is supposed to be about what happens in this life. Judaism's response about what happens after death is a little bit more vague. It ties into the idea of we've not talked to somebody who's come back from it, so therefore we don't know for sure. And yes, there have been those near-death experiences and all of those, and we can parse those if you'd like. But the concept is no one's called up and said, Murray, this is exactly what it's like. This is what you have to look forward to, So there are some beliefs, but also based on some assumptions that Judaism makes that make things a little bit different. So for the most part, the idea is you live in this life, and if you get it right here, whatever happens next will take care of itself, right? We don't do in this life in order to worry about what happens next. The other part that we need to talk about is the assumption, and I get myself into a little bit of trouble because as a rabbi, I know enough Christian theology to be dangerous, but I am not in any way, shape, or form a scholar, right? I will tell you this is what I know, and I know what I know about. But one of the things within Judaism is it has to do with the assumption about the soul. Judaism's assumption about the soul is we talk about being made in the image of the divine. For the most part, Judaism's assumption about that is that the soul is that little bit of the divine that exists within each of us, right? Therefore, if it is given to us by God, that part of that little piece of soul is inherently good, right? It is what we do in life are things that hide the soul from being seen. If you want to use the image of, imagine you've just a freshly shucked ear of corn that still has everything attached to it at the bottom, right? There are little things that we do that hide the corn, to hide the ear of corn on the inside, put up pieces of silk. Those are little things that we do. There are bigger things that we do that are putting up pieces of the husk, right? That hide the soul from being seen. But Judaism's ultimate belief is because that soul is divine, it is inherently good, and therefore, after a period of repentance, cleansing, atonement, you can use all sorts of different phrases for it, it ultimately is purified to the state it was given to us in, and therefore returns to God. And this is not, by the way, a statement that Judaism believes just for Jews. This is what Judaism believes happens to everybody, right? And so the concept is that that I guess you might call it the concept of, I'm never completely comfortable using the term, but it's kind of like the concept of purgatory, where one goes to pay off sins that either could not be forgiven in life or were not forgiven in life, right? And eventually one receives forgiveness from God, and then that soul is reunited with God. Exactly what does that mean? That's a really good question. And some people say it's the energy returning to God and becoming part of God as one. Others talk about it as being a Garden of Eden-like experience. I don't know. Some of what I think tends to vary on what day it is, because what do I find the most satisfying that particular day? But the concept is, as strange as it sounds, the concept is the belief that all of us will eventually be reunited with God. That there is no such thing as eternal, there is no hell within Judaism. That's not to say that asking for gaining forgiveness is an easy or pleasant, but it is there's no such thing as permanent, right? And people will often look at me and say, does that mean that Hitler eventually goes to heaven? And the answer I choose to believe is yes. Do I want it to be quick? No. But do I want to believe that in each individual is the spark of the divine? Yes. And in order to say that, I have to be willing to say the other, right? And so it obviously changes the way Judaism approaches some of these issues. And Judaism, for the most part, operates on a very practical level, right? It's what we know, what we don't know, what we believe we have control over, what we understand we don't have control over, and the attempt to try and live the way we can in the best relationship with God that we can, and best relationship with God and other people as we can. Somebody else came up and asked about the 613 commandments and said, how do you manage all of those? Well, first of all, the answer is we don't, because not all 613 commandments are applicable to today's world, right? One of the most important parts is I don't have to worry about what I plant in my field because I don't have a field that gets planted, right? But there are laws about planting your field and about the sabbatical year and and they have a purpose, and they are still read and discussed and debated, not because I'm necessarily worried about am I literally following what it says, right? Because we all do things that are based on some of that biblical material, right? The whole idea of giving charity, right? Where does it come from, right? It comes from the idea of we are expected to leave the corners of our fields for the widow, the poor, and the orphan, right? And the idea came of, well, what happens if you don't have a field? We give a portion of what we reap in charity, right? So it's an ancient idea. We're still doing it in kind of a way, but no, I'm not a farmer, so I'm not worried about it. But we still talk about it. The other part of it is Judaism is not, I'm going to say this carefully, for me, Judaism is not just a religious faith. Judaism for me is my way of life. Judaism affects as much of my life as I let it affect, based on what I'm willing to let in, right? Because what I've always found fascinating about Judaism is some of those 613 commandments include things like laws about your responsibility as an employer to your employees. That if you hire somebody to do a job and you have more than they do, you're expected to pay them honestly and on time. You don't hold on to their wages unnecessarily. I look at that and I say, it's a religious principle because it's talking about social justice issues. But at the same time, it's not a religious issue in terms of saying, this is how you celebrate this, that, or the other thing, right? But it's saying that Judaism has the opportunity to be part of almost every decision that you make, right? For me, you heard the explanation downstairs of which soup the bacon was left out of the potato soup, right? That was my fault, because my request was for vegetarian soups, because I follow the Jewish dietary laws within reason, in terms of somebody strictly Orthodox would not have eaten downstairs because the kitchens were not kosher, you don't know where it was made, you know who it was made, all sorts of things, right? My comment is, if anybody's trying really hard to slip in the pork fat on top, by me, as long as I am trying reasonably well, because I don't do it because I'm worried that God says, oh my God, he ate a piece of bacon, right? I don't honestly think God cares what I eat. The difference is, can I take what something like eating, which is a rather mundane thing, and can I make it into a holy action? And I make it into a holy action by trying to be aware of the food that I eat. And for me, it's my practice of gratitude by saying, I will look at the food I eat and I will look at the ingredients and I will pay attention, and that if I want the ice cream for dessert, I'm not going to have the steak for dinner, right? Because I want to be aware of, for me, I always look at it as, they talk about, and I don't want to get too far off course, we're going to get that far off course, but they talk about, you sit down with a bag of chips, right, and you mindlessly eat your way through it, right? I look at it as my goal is to make sure that I'm not mindlessly eating ever. Do we do it? Of course. But the idea is, do we pay attention to it? The other thing that you must understand from a Jewish perspective is, and I will say that maybe this comes from being the parent religion, right? Because both Islam and Christianity come from Judaism. Judaism never says we have the only right way. Judaism says we have our way. This works for us. This works for me. Something else works for you? The response is, Geh Gesundheit, live and be well. Right? Do what works for you. And just show us the same in return. Because I'm not out to convert anybody. Right? I simply talk out of my experience and say, this is the way I live my life, and this is the way I bring God into my life, right? I'm not saying it's the only one, because I have friends who are of numerous religious faiths, and some of them I look in awe at some of them as holy people, right? Because they live lives that are truly fantastic. So the hope is that way we look at things, we understand that what we do is part of, that's why it's so much focused on this world, right? Because, again, if we can get it right here, right, and we have enough faith in God, then whatever happens next should be okay. Okay. Any other questions I can answer before we dive in? Because I could probably spend the next time answering your questions if that was what you want. They said they bring in texts, but I'm also happy if we, Should we go to Jonah? Okay. The book of Jonah. One of my favorite biblical books. So let's talk a little bit about Jonah. Jonah, if you go back to that sheet that has the Hebrew Bible on it, you notice Jonah is listed as one of the 12, right? But Jonah is a really unique character out of those 12 minor prophets. He's a minor prophet, remember, because his book is short. It's four chapters, right? They're not easy chapters, but they're four really well written and interesting ones. It is one of the few books of the prophets that's actually written in a narrative. It tells a story. Most of the time, what do we get? We get God appeared to Hosea. Hosea said to the people, "You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, this, and this is going to happen to you." What happens? The people don't listen, and this, and sometimes happen. Or sometimes they run the prophet off and say, "Get out of here, we don't want to hear what you have to say." Right? That's most of what the prophetic books have. Most of them don't tell us a story. But Jonah is one of the few that does. And it tells us the story. The question is really, why is the story there? Right? Because you might argue that Jonah is the meta-prophet. He is the story of what does it mean to do the job of a prophet. Right? Because it starts out where Jonah is called. Jonah gets called by God, go to Nineveh, right? What makes that interesting? What makes that interesting to begin with? Well, first of all, they were the enemies of the Israelites. They were non-Israelites, right? And God is saying, I want you to go there, tell them that they're doing the wrong thing so I don't have to destroy them. Jonah's sitting here going, but I want you to destroy them. They're our enemies. Right? So what does Jonah do? He runs away. Right? As I mentioned, and I talked about this in the first half, how many of the prophets actually said, "Sign me up, this is a job I want"? Right? None of them. Jonah tells the story of what it's like to be a prophet by rejecting the call to be a prophet. He not only doesn't want to be a prophet, he doesn't want to go where he's called to go, and because he doesn't want the outcome to be what the outcome should be. Right? So he becomes this example of what is it like to be a prophet. And then what happens to him? He gets on the ships to Tarshish, which we think is somewhere towards the Spanish end of the Mediterranean. Right? The waves. Everyone prays to God, prays to their gods. They cast lots and they say to Jonah, "Okay, it's your fault. This is all happening." Right? What does Jonah do? Right? He goes down to the hold and takes a nap. Right? They wake him up and go, "What are you doing?" And he says, "It's my fault. Throw me overboard." Right? What does the text tell us? They don't want to throw him overboard. They try rowing to the shore a little bit more, but the waves get stronger. And right before they throw him in, the non-Israelites ask for forgiveness from God, saying, "We don't want to kill this man, but it seems to be the only way to save ourselves is to throw him overboard." Right? So they throw him overboard, and the sea is calm. Right? What happens next? Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit more about the whale, the big fish, right? The answer is we often tell it to the kids as a whale, right? According to the text itself, it was a big fish, right? And then we have the chapter that we're going to look at. But I want to go through the rest of the background of the story before we take a look. This is what happens to Jonah. This is what Jonah does in the belly of the whale, and it probably is one of my favorite pieces of biblical text. And you might think I'm a little crazy. You're probably right. But when we look at it, hopefully you'll get a sense as to why I might say that. Finally, then he goes to Nineveh, fulfills the obligation he's supposed to do in the first place, tells Nineveh, and what happens? Right. Compared to the Israelites, they listen. Right? This is part of what Jonah was afraid of in the first place. We've had all of these prophets that say, don't stop doing what you're doing. And the people, right? He goes to Nineveh. They all say, oh, we're doing the wrong thing. We've got to change what we're doing. Right? The absolute worst outcome, because not only does they save the enemy, but the Israelites are made to look bad in Jonah's eyes, because they don't listen as well. Right? And then we get this other weird chapter which tells the story of a gourd. Right? Jonah goes up to watch what happens in Nineveh. They builds this little, I call it a sukkah, this little booth, right? Apparently a miraculous gourd grows up to gives him shade one day. It dies overnight, and then when it dies, Jonah basically says, "Oi, life is so terrible. Kill me now." Right? And God says, "Are you really so aggrieved over how terrible your life is, because I took the gourd away, the plant that was giving you shade, that you're willing to give up your life over it?" And he goes, "Yes." And God says, "Well, and you want me to give up on the people of Nineveh?" And the book ends right there. Right? And the very ending words I always found fascinating, because it talks about it's a city of, is it 300,000 people? I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but the number of people and sheep and cattle. Right? They get included in part of what God is supposed to be concerned about, that Jonah was just getting rid of. So he talks about this kind of meta prophecy, meta life as a prophet. So what's the book about? Well, its biggest theme is that of repentance. Right? Can we repent to God to the point where God will then spare us? Right? Is that possible? It's a resounding yes. And in fact, the book of Jonah itself is actually used on one of our most important days of the year. In the afternoon service for the Day of Atonement, when we go through the process of asking for forgiveness, Jonah is the text of the whole book is the text of the prophets that we read that day. Why? Because it's saying, just as the Ninevites were able to be forgiven, so too can we be forgiven. Right? So that's our first part. What else is the book about? Right? Forgiveness. Mm-hmm. Thankfulness. How? Okay. Well, we'll get back to that. You're starting to look at the text already, but that we'll get there. But you're right. Thanking God. Right.
The prophet fighting with God about what he's going to do or not.
Mm-hmm. What is it like to be called, which is an interesting thing. I also think that there's a message here that is part of what kind of ties back to a little bit what we were talking about a few minutes ago in terms of Judaism's approach to the world, right? Jonah is a particularist. He's saying, I want to be representative and I want you to do this just for my people. Right? And what is God saying? God's saying more than no. God is saying, my relationship is not just with you. It is a universalistic message. My relationship is as true with the Ninevites as it is with you. Who said you cornered the market on the relationship with me? It is a universalistic message. Okay. So that brings us to this particular chapter of text, chapter 2. So chapter 2, I'm just looking at the time up there. Chapter 2 is what Jonah does when he's in the belly of the big fish. He's gotten thrown in, he's been swallowed up, and this is what the text tells us happens in the belly of the whale. Would somebody just read? It's 11 verses. It's not really long. And if just as a note for everybody to see, I think I can get this up. When we talk about the difference in translation, this is the length of the second chapter in the Hebrew. That's the length of the chapter in English, right? The Hebrew is far more compact, which is also what makes it sometimes more challenging to unpack, because when things get when the language gets constructed and you have to pull it apart, sometimes it can be pulled apart in multiple ways. And that's one of the things that makes it interesting. So would you please read?
The Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah remained in the fish's belly 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. He said, "In my trouble I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the belly of Sheol I cried out, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the depths, into the heart of the sea. The floods engulfed me. All your breakers and billows swept over me. I thought I was driven away out of your sight. Would I ever gaze again upon your holy temple? The waters closed in over me, the deep engulfed me. Weeds twined around my head. I sank to the base of the mountains. The bars of the earth closed upon me forever. Yet you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was ebbing away, I called to the Lord to mind, and my prayer came before you into your holy temple. They who cling to empty folly forsake their own welfare, but I, with loud thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will perform. Deliverance is the Lord's. The Lord commanded the fish, and it spewed Jonah out upon dry land.
The kids always love it because we get to talk about fish vomiting. Right? What's going on? What do you notice about this chapter? There's a reason I brought the psalm with me. Good. Yes, it does remind me, it should remind you a little bit of the psalm. Right? It shouldn't just remind you of the psalm we read. It should remind you of a couple of other ones too. Right? In my trouble I called out to the Lord and he answered me. I always, trying to remember the number of that one. Is that 120? I don't remember. But the idea that God answered, somebody else remembers it, please tell me which one it is. But the idea, I cried out and you responded to me. also from a psalm, right? The belly of Sheol, I was near death. Right? Words we saw in Psalm 88. Right? You cast me into the depths of the seas, the floods engulfed me, your breakers, the same word. Right? Your breakers and billows swept over me. I thought I was driven out of your sight. Jonah knew, at least I believe, Jonah, or the author of Jonah, knew the Psalms and was writing with the Psalms in mind. And that we see this allusion to the Psalms, right, in this prayer. It tells us something about Jonah, or at least about the author, that this was somebody who was really well versed. Right? They knew what they were writing, right? And that they constructed this prayer with a lot of forethought. So this is Jonah's prayer. What surprises you about it? Right. This is a guy in the belly of a fish. He's been down there 3 days. Right? It tells us very clearly, 3 days, 3 nights. And what is he doing? He's praising God. Right? He's using some of the greatest words of praise, the Psalms, that have ever been written to praise God while he's in the belly of a fish. Okay? Why?
What's he got to lose?
Absolutely. What's he got to lose? Right? That running away didn't work. Right? Right. But what does his praise? There's an expectation that is written into the praise that he gives. God's going to help him. Right? Everything's going to be all right. He is in the darkest place we can possibly imagine. Right? I don't know, being down in the depths in the belly of a fish for 3 days and 3 nights, I don't think you can get much darker. But he has this moment of resilience and this moment of saying, but I know it's going to be okay. You're going to save me. Right? So even though he is not yet out of the belly of the fish, he thanks God for getting him out of the belly of the fish. Right? He uses some of the exact same words of despair that the Psalm 88 used, but uses them incredibly differently. The moment of death and darkness, what does it remind us of? What does it remind us of? It reminds us of the fact that in the end, each of us is given a choice. We choose whether we're Psalm 88 or whether we're Jonah. Right? And you know what? Sometimes it's right to be the person from Psalm 88. And sometimes it's right to be Jonah. Right? There are times where it's okay for us to say, yes, we have the faith. Right? And there are times that we can say, no, we don't. Right? So I bring, because we're almost, we have about 10 minutes left. Because we were looking at this and you were talking about despair, I think Jonah, of anybody, has the right to despair. But we're given what is an incredibly hopeful message by a guy who really shouldn't have a whole lot of hope.
Verse 5.
Mm-hmm.
At a point That was my greatest fear at that point.
Because what is the fear? The fear is being lost to God. Right? And the darkness, whether it is literal or figurative, is scary. Right? But the question is, what do we do in those moments? How do we feel in those moments? And I love the fact that you can see the language, the way the language gets played with, both in the psalm and in this text, but they play out very differently. And I think that, for me, is the beauty of the biblical text. This is, for me, when you read this and you say, even though things can suck, I have hope that it will get better. He says this, I am sure it's going to get better. You cast me out. I thought I was dead. Would I ever see your temple again? And he is saying this with absolute surety that he will. Right? He says, I have faith that I'm going to come out on the other side. I like the text because, first of all, I think it's one of the texts that we never read enough, right? Interestingly enough, for many years, this chapter was left out of the High Holiday ritual because they were trying to shorten the reading a little bit, and it didn't advance the narrative, So when they redid it, I fought hard with folks, and I said, you got to put it back in. This is the best chapter of all of them, right? Because it's about the concept of if we can have faith even in moments of darkness. And so we all know from our own lives, hopefully not too frequently, we've all suffered despair and challenges. At the same, and we also hope the fact that we have lived through them and come out hopefully stronger or more faithful on the other side. But that the wide range of human emotions is in our biblical texts, and it gives us permission to feel all of them, right? And one of the things that I often talk about when we talk about Torah, for example, is I am awed by the fact that the text that we read, that we hold as holy, is as human as it is, right? We talk about the fact that within Judaism, we talk about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, right? We've read their stories. Are these people we want to emulate? Right? Who are they? They're human. They're us. The biblical material is not written about people that we have no chance of being like. The biblical material, and I talk here from the Jewish Bible, is all written about people who are just like all of us. Right? For me, that gives me more hope than anything else, is because I can see us in the book when I read. And that's what I challenge you to do as you go forth from today on. Whether it is in a moment of despair, or whether it is in a moment of faith saying, I know it's going to be all right, that you know that you are in and part of that text, and that it lives through you as you live. That's what it means to bring God's word into the world. It's about doing that part in our lives, and that makes the world so much of a better place. Any other questions that I can answer on the text? Yeah, please. Sorry, that got to the end of a sermon there. It's the rabbi in me. You can't.
Okay. When we read Hebrew scriptures or we read scriptures of the church, we sometimes see scenes and episodes where the Word of God is particularly dynamic, where it accomplishes things, often apart from us, like Genesis 1 or Valley Dry Bones. And it also seems to play a role here. I always pictured Jonah, when in Nineveh, kind of mumbling, repent, it's going to happen. I don't really picture him like, shouting from mountaintops with great energy. It's almost despite his mumbling, it happens. Could you talk about, how, from your perspective or a Jewish perspective, in 3 minutes, does dynamic Word of God or sometimes less dynamic?
I think we're given to see the dynamism and the lack thereof. To some extent, they go together. There's a biblical expression that when it talks about where is God, you talk about God's words achieving things, like in the story of creation, right? Where God makes God's announcement to the Ninevites seems to work, right? But I also reflect on the fact that, for me, one of the most powerful moments expressed about God is the concept of what is referred to in Hebrew as the kol dmama, the still small voice, right? Where the concept is God is not in the fire and not in the thunder and not in the earthquakes and not in the noise, right? Where is God? God is in the smallest sound that we can possibly hear, right? There's debate as to what does that sound actually sound like, right? Within Judaism, you can debate almost everything. Well, but that's actually, I should explain, I make fun of that, but at the same time, that's also very much part of our tradition, is that asking questions and going back and forth is really very much a part of it, because the idea is that we learn from each other, we learn from the process, and that's one of the reasons why, for me, I love the opportunity to do this kind of work, because I learn from everybody, I learn from all of you, right? It's that kind of interaction, and that's why it's important, because we continue to learn that way. So for me, when I hear, it's the diminutiveness of that. So it is, I think, for me, one of those messages that says, yes, God's voice can be very big, and there are times where we see God's voice active and doing. But there are also times when we know that God is in that still small voice. And that different times, it's not that God is different, right? It's that we need a different face of God at different moments in our lives, right? There's an old Jewish teaching that talks about the 70 faces of God. They like the number 7 and 10 and are numbers that Judaism really likes. Right? And so they put them together. It's not the idea that God has 70 faces, right? But that there are different ways that we interact with God at different moments in our lives, right? And I freely acknowledge that my belief today is not what it was 30 years ago, right? It's changed. I hope it's matured a little bit. And my own experience has informed it, right? But at the same time, that doesn't mean God changed. That just means I changed, right? And that ultimately, when we gather for groups like this, I'm assuming this is what the purpose of your gatherings are, is to allow us to grow. So I think we can see in the loudness and in the quiet. And I like the fact that there's both. We also see plenty of times where, shall we say, God says, and it doesn't come to be, right? lots of the prophets include material like that. I think Hosea takes that to a divine art because the comparison between the people of Israel and God's relationship, and Hosea and his relationship with the harlot, his wife, who's a harlot, and that those are seen as an allegory for each other. Oy. Hopefully but it's the concept that we. There are plenty of times where God says, and we don't always listen. That doesn't always mean, right, that God doesn't stop talking. Right. It's also the reminder to us that what's the inverse of that? That sometimes we pray for things, right? And sometimes what's the answer? Yeah, sometimes the answer is no. Right? That doesn't mean God's not listening. Right? I've had this conversation with lots of kids over but I really want, yeah. And the answer is no. Right? Just because the answer is no doesn't mean God didn't hear it. It just means we didn't get the outcome that we were looking for. Right? And so that's part of what I think challenges us. So I don't know if I answered the question or not. It got... Any other questions before we call it an evening? Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to spend this time with you. I will wish you a blessed Easter season as we go on, because this year both Easter and Passover fall together. Whereas you will notice next year they are significantly separated because we have what we refer to in Judaism as a leap year. But our leap year adds an extra month, not an extra day. But part of that has to do with the fact that our calendar is a hybrid between the solar and the lunar calendar, mostly based on the lunar calendar. But if we based it solely on the lunar calendar, we would be celebrating the harvest holidays at the wrong time. So they created this leap year system that means that we are celebrating, like the upcoming Passover holiday, which is the barley harvest, is sometime around when the barley would actually be harvested, as opposed to, in the middle of winter. So, thank you all very much.
Wanted again say thank you so much to Rabbi Brian Michelson, and a total thank you for you as well. But what a great gift it is for you to be a prophet in our midst, and to let your kernels of corn and your corniness. It's a treat to be able to serve alongside you. Can we give Brian another hand?